Looking for some perspective on the Ukraine-Russia war? Stick with me on FlyWire as we take a look at that war and where it's going. Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on FlyWire we're going to look at the state of the Ukrainian war, both on the ground and in the air, particularly in the air. It's kind of my personal bailiwick, or especially. The hottest thing in the news right now are calls for a no-fly zone, okay? And I think it's right for the NATO to shy away from imposing a no-fly zone over Korea arbitrarily or by themselves. NATO is a defense alliance, and imposing a no-fly zone over a country that is not part of that alliance is an act of offense, an initial act of war. I think it's totally outside their charter. They can't do it by themselves. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a no-fly zone. It's probably a good idea. There are precedents for a no-fly zone, but they have all been under the United Nations imprimatur, if you will. You got to ask yourself, why hasn't the UN been involved in any of this? Crickets. There are 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council: China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And guess what? All the resolutions that affect security that could establish a no-fly zone must come through the Security Council, and any of the 5 permanent members can veto resolutions. So I count 2 vetoes right there, China and Russia. So it ain't going to happen. Historically, the Soviet Union was one of the original 5 permanent members. The Republic of China was an original member of the Council as well in 1945, but that seat transferred to the Chinese Communist People's Republic of China after the fall of Chiang Kai-shek's government in 1949. Russia, the current Russia, the country of Russia, inherited its permanent seat on the Soviet Union's permanent seat on the Council when they collapsed. The Security Council has authorized 17 peacekeeping operations in the past, including the Korean War. Force or military action has been part of those operations. Since Russia's intervention in Ukraine in 2014 and then in Syria, the UN has become totally ineffective, failing to act. The UN was created just for this issue, and no one even mentions it. When a member of the top 5 of the Security Council is the one invading another country, the UN just fades into the background. Is this the end of the UN? Should it be? I think they need to change something. There is a precedent for NATO establishing a no-fly zone over a non-participating nation. The request was made by the Arab League to the Security Council, and they authorized the use of force in 2011 to enact a no-fly zone over Libya during the collapse of its government. NATO mobilized to enforce the resolution, and note that NATO did not act independently. The UN Security Council voted to establish a no-fly zone, and NATO countries imposed it. Of course, Libya did not have nuclear weapons either, but in Korea, the Russians did supply and man the MiG fighters that the Chinese and North Koreans used to fight the UN forces, predominantly led by the U.S. The Russians had successfully tested a nuclear detonation in 1949 and then a full-blown weapon in 1953 at the end of the Korean War. The bottom line is that the UN must vote to establish a no-fly zone with volunteer forces. And since both Russia and China can veto such a resolution, it ain't going to happen. NATO's charter does not allow offensive action, and it's a really bad idea to start now. Does that mean there is no other option than to allow the Russian Air Force free reign over Ukrainian airspace? Well, no. The air above a modern battlefield is a lethal place to be. The Ukrainian Air Force started the war with just under 100 fighter-type aircraft, MiG-29s, Su-27s, Su-24s, and 25s, last being the ground attack airplanes. Losses have been estimated about 39 aircraft. The US DoD estimates that as of a couple of days ago, the UK Air Force still had 56 operational fighters. I've been able to piece together reports from about a week ago of 31 Russian aircraft and 40 helicopters shot down. Some reports peg the Russian losses anywhere from 50-ish to over 100, and maybe that includes the helicopters. Russians aren't flying at night in any numbers. and they are not operating coordinated strikes. Individual strikes seem to be the norm. They have some air-to-air kills in the war, but they have been rare on both sides. The ghost of Kyiv has been exposed as a myth. Maybe, maybe not. At this point, reliable reports are few and far between. It does seem a little bit hard to believe, though, that that could happen. Watching the supposed video of 2 shoot-downs, I must admit some skepticism. A couple of quick observations about those videos. For the whole engagement to be filmed with the phone is not plausible. They look like they're flying better, way better than 420 knots, and that is about 7 miles a minute. You cover a lot of ground in just a few seconds. Filming the head-on engagement and then stay in the frame of the phone for more than a 180-degree turn, yeah, it's just optimistic. For that turn, you'd have to be doing better than 8G in the level turn. That close, that small of a turn radius, and that uses a lot of energy. The jets never slow down. From the ground, you'd never be able to tell who's a good guy and who's a bad guy. The airplanes on both sides are the same. You can't see the markings from the ground anyway at that speed. The flight path of the second fighter shot down is just plain dubious. I just don't believe it. It looks programmed to me. Could an engagement like that happen? Well, it could. Did it? Well, maybe. I doubt it, though. Fake news, probably, filling in the blanks, honoring a rumor, myth, I've heard it all, whatever. One thing I do know about war is that the first reports are almost always wrong. Always. It seems to be a human need to spread the word as fast as possible. Accuracy be damned. Happens all the time. Also in war, there's always fake news and propaganda from both sides. You have to be careful with anything you hear or see, even in video nowadays. I think that was probably DCS or something like that. It was pretty sophisticated, but I think it was still video. It's going to be quite a while before we know the truths of the Ukraine war. It just is. But the real lesson we need to acknowledge is that the flying over a modern battlefield is a dangerous thing to do. The only way to fly over hostile territory with impunity is by obtaining air superiority. The U.S. success in doing that in the 2 Gulf Wars is due to SEAD, suppression of enemy air defense. Direct SEAD is done in 2 ways, either lethal or jamming. Either you kill the enemy radar or the missiles, or you jam the radar spectrum that they see in so the operators can't see you. Stealth plays a role here, and the U.S. has gone heavily into stealth these days. The Russians have not. Sheer numbers of aircraft targeting air defense on the ground to neutralize them, and also altitude that you fly plays a huge role. If you go in solo or with one flight, then you're easy targets. The altitude you use depends on the threat. Surface-to-air missiles, air defense artillery, ADA, SAMs are the technology that are used to shoot aircraft down. The problem faced by SAMs is acquisition of the target. In other words, where can they see them? It's going to be radar primarily for longer range, and where can they shoot them? The Russian S-400 and S-300 SAMs are long-range systems that have pretty sophisticated radars, but radar is a line-of-sight system. It has to work line of sight, which means that after about 18 miles or so, the curvature of the Earth creates a shadow zone that cannot be covered by their surface radar. The SAM can't see the target and therefore can't shoot them. The S-400 SAM has 4 different missiles that it can use, primarily just range issues, from 200 miles down to about 20 miles. The S-300, which both sides possess, has a range of about 60 miles. And it's a much shorter range SAM that uses radar. Even shorter range SAMs exist that use radar, infrared, or even optical guidance. If you can't suppress ADA, like the S-400 or S-300, then you have to fly low. And when you're low, you face shorter range systems to include Manpads, manned portable air defense systems. And these use infrared guidance primarily. The US-made version is the Stinger, which remains highly effective and has for years. The Russian version is the SA-14 or Strela or Gremlin. It's a derivative of the SA-7. These Manpads can be lethal against non-maneuvering targets. To employ a Manpad, SAM against an airborne target, you have to visually see it. And then you have to acquire it with the seeker on the missile. And that works to be about a 2-mile range to make that happen. For a fighter doing 7 to 8 miles a minute, that means you're in the engagement zone for a very short amount of time. For a transport or a helicopter, you're in that engagement zone for much longer. And in those airplanes, you can't maneuver very much if one is fired at you. So that makes them a bit more lethal against slower targets. The Su-25s in particular are having a tough time. As of a week ago, I was able to get good estimate of aircraft losses above Ukraine. It appears that the Russians had lost about 31 fighter-type aircraft and the Ukrainians over 40. I said before 39. There are reports of higher losses. Who knows? The Ukrainian Air Force started with 99 fighters and now they have 56. So I have some belief that is probably reliable. Helicopter losses on both sides have been very high, and I'm not even going to track that. It's just hard to keep track of all those. Both sides apparently have lost quite a few. The biggest losses in life and equipment were experienced by the Russians with the shoot-down of 2 Ilyushin 76 transports with troops on board during the attack on Hostomel Airport northwest of Kyiv. They were apparently going in to help secure the airport, and they got shot down. To a large extent, the air war over Ukraine has devolved into a stalemate with hit-and-run tactics by both sides. The Russians don't fly at night, and their losses have forced them into be very hesitant to fly during the day. The Ukraine Air Force appears to be flying very low high-speed intercepts or airstrikes, primarily from the west. The Ukrainians are using Turkish-built Bayraktar drones with quite a bit of success. These drones we've seen them attack that 40-mile column northwest of Kyiv, as well as other places in the combat area. The air battle is a good place for these drones. This one is a medium altitude long-range drone, which means that it flies in about the 10 to 19,000-ish altitude range, and it's operated by a remote ground controller, much like American drones are, and it has achieved some spectacular results on video. A thunderstorm. That juicy 40-mile-long convoy was sort of safe from manned air attack because of the environment, the ADA environment, and dispersing it into the woods made it less vulnerable. It's very close to the Russian S-400 SAMs, and the threat overhead is still very, very high. Drones have been effective, but you can only hit 1 or 2 targets at a time with that drone, and you need to take out 20, 30, or 40 vehicles about the same time to really hit that convoy and to neutralize it. Pretty tough to do. To sum up, the air war hasn't significantly changed over Ukraine since the invasion, and it's a stalemate. And the only aircraft that seems to operate effectively is the Bayraktar drone. From what I can tell, Ukraine had about 18 of those when the war started, and reports are they received another number, unknown exactly, on 2 March as resupply. At this point, we just don't have any idea how many have been shot down. Given the real risk to aircraft and the fact that neither side can suppress SAMs, I don't see air as being decisive in this war. In fact, I would venture to say that there's little likelihood of any decisive weapon system or force that is going to be decisive for either side at this point. It's almost a stalemate. The Russians still have a large advantage in numbers. The Ukraine military was defensive in scope and smaller, much smaller in size. For the air bases, I didn't see any hardened shelters that are required to operate in the target zone, making them vulnerable to a missile attack. During the Cold War, both sides developed shelters for airplanes and people to protect assets during an attack, and then begin operations soon after, clear up the taxiways and runway, and go off. The first TAV-Vs, also known as HAZs, H-A-S, hardened aircraft shelters, were built for F-86 sized airplanes in the early 60s, operated out of some of those with the F-4, and you had to fold the wings to get it in, and it was a tight fit even then. The third generation shelters at RAF Lakenheath could fit 2 F-15Es in them easily, although to start and taxi out of the shelter, you really could only house 1 at a time. The only air bases that can be used by Ukraine are in the west, and they're, like I said, subject to missile attack. This pushes the Ukrainian Air Force into hit-and-run operations by itself, which means that the air cannot be coordinated with ground operations. Soviet airplanes have short range and no refueling capability, and they're flying from Russian bases, maybe Belarus, I have not heard that, Belarus, further restricting their area of operations. Fuel is a big restriction. And they're using occasional hit-and-run operations as well. As a student of warfare, ground and air campaigns, I expected the Russian strategy to be one of lightning or blitzkrieg. Strong armored thrusts supported by mechanized infantry advancing very rapidly across narrow fronts. Schwerpunkt. Point. Concentrate your forces and jam it in there. Supported by units for flank security, but speed. This was the composition of the Russian forces gathered around Ukraine prior to 24 February. But what I didn't see in the satellite imagery that the news showed us was any serious logistical buildup. Without a significant logistics tail, you can't support an army of 190,000 in the field for very long, especially in a hot war. My thought was that this was just a pressure campaign, a show of force meant to achieve the objective of neutralizing Ukraine by threat. The political reaction to the Russian threat was, how should we say, lukewarm and in a way unserious. And the U.S. president himself said that a minor incursion would have to be evaluated. I'm sorry, but when you're talking about an invasion of another country, there's no such thing as a minor invasion, minor incursion. I think the signals Putin received were that he would suffer no serious backlash if he did invade, so he did. The reasons for the invasion, to return Ukraine back to a vassal Russian state from the status quo of the communist regime, or for Russian prestige, or as another cash cow for Putin and his kleptocracy to loot, just doesn't matter. The forces on the ground and in the air are what matters now. Sanctions after the fact, in other words, after the invasion, will not serve to stop the invasion. In fact, they incentivize more aggression so that Russia will be able to negotiate a withdrawal from a stronger position. Without a significant force to threaten the destruction of the deployed Russian forces, there's little incentive to unilaterally withdraw. There isn't. Exactly the opposite situation is where we find ourselves. Russia has to have the entire country in its grip to force the world to lift the sanctions and get back to normal. That's what it's got to do. That's its objective now. We didn't see a Russian blitzkrieg. I wish people stopped using that term, because what happened is not that. From reports, the Russian forces, the rank and file, thought they were on exercises and not actually in a shooting war. The Russian units crossed into Ukraine territory with about 3 days of food and fuel, probably a basic load of ammunition, and then so they were not equipped to supply deep armored thrusts over a few strategic avenues of advance. They just weren't, and that's it. My experience with Russians, besides reading of the Eastern Front in World War II, was preparing to fight them in the Cold War in Germany. Huge armored columns of tanks and mechanized infantry were expected in the Fulda Gap, just about any time, frankly, and a couple of other avenues then across the Iron Curtain were also avenues of attack. And that Iron Curtain, if you don't remember, is what separated East Germany and West Germany. It was the main area of conflict, expected to be. The Russians had learned armored warfare from the Germans in World War II and had gotten pretty good at it. Their forces were massive. The battle was expected to be a huge, desperate attempt by NATO to blunt the onslaught long enough, to hold them, slow them down, and then hopefully flank the invaders. The Russians were assessed to be a much more powerful and formidable foe at the time. After the Iron Curtain fell, my wife and I went into East Germany on a vacation and saw a few of the air bases that were my targets previously. We saw the countryside and the people, and what I saw was a threadbare, desultory populace living in a land that had seemed just to have been recently cleared away the rubble of World War II. Bullet holes are still in the walls in the villages. Very little progress had been made in 40 years. The vaunted air bases were disheveled, and the hardware, including airplanes, were scattered haphazardly here and there, just everywhere, and not taken care of. They were not a foe ready to invade the West. We didn't know that at the time. NATO in those years was I think, a very robust, coordinated was very robust and coordinated, and it was ready to fight for survival. And then I fought in the first Gulf War and found that the Iraqis, who were also well equipped, but they were untrained and unmotivated. And a deeper look into their war with Iran revealed to me the true lack of understanding on how to fight modern military equipment on a modern battlefield, and they showed that in the Gulf War as well. The Iranians, I think, in their war with Iraq did better than the Iraqis, but not by a large margin. And I put that down to motivation. The West had developed military forces that could operate in coordination on a dynamic battlefield. Truly, it was a combined arms operation. In the intervening years, NATO has fallen on hard times. I'm not sure what they could do now. The U.S. showed just how to do a combined arms blitzkrieg, basically, in both Gulf Wars. What I expected was that the Russians had gone to school on the American example of mechanized maneuver warfare. I expected rapid deep thrusts that would strike so deep into Ukraine they would render the defense ineffective. Surrounding forces and everything would fall apart. We didn't see that at all. Whether the Russian leadership only expected a 3-day war and the Ukrainians would fold like a cheap suit doesn't really matter. You don't build strategy and operations around such wishful thinking and then expect it to all work out. War never works out according to your plan. So, as we all know, on February 24th in 2022, the Russians advanced across a broad front from the north and the east into the Ukraine, pushing in to the country. I didn't expect a penetration to be made from the north via Belarus, and the news was very spotty on reporting Russian forces there prior to 24 Feb. I think we heard something on the 23rd. Finally it broke or something, but not what it really looked like. However, the drive through Chernobyl to Kyiv should have been the prime armored thrust in conjunction with one coming across the Russian border to strike deep and surround the capital and cut off the government. The center of gravity of Ukraine at that time was the government. In week 2, we can see that the most Russian advances have been along the road network around those avenues that they first invaded, and they're not very deep. Ukraine Army has done a very good job of delay and interdiction. Reports from the battlefield says that the Ukraine Army concentrated on supply and fuel trucks as priorities early on. I mean, after all, a tank needs to be refueled quite often, and fuel mileage is reckoned in single digits, and troops need to eat and drink water, and if you don't have all of that, you kind of pin them, especially not having fuel. The largest tank battles in history were between the Russians and the Germans in the cursed Kharkiv, or Kharkov at the time, area, which is the eastern part of the Ukraine, and should be tank country. This is where it happened. But the Russians have mostly restricted their operations to Ukraine roads. This dependence on the road network really interested me. In World War II, German supply came via railroads, the Russians as well. All across Europe, and as the Germans depended heavily on rail, never really had a road network, road logistics system. This was also true in Russia. Even though today the road network in Russia, as well as Ukraine, is not as developed as the Western countries. The Russians are so dependent on rail supply that they created a logistical support arm totally centered on rail and railroad repair foreshadowing, okay, they're going to attack our rail and we'll get it back into service. They really don't have a ground mobile capability. Trucks are used to disperse supply to units from forward rail terminals, and to me that reflects a severe limited lift capacity. Their off-road capability also seems to be very, very limited. This is diametrically opposed to the U.S. NATO military organization, which is concentrated on off-road mobility and bridging capability. Usage of roads is still done for speed, but it's not a deal breaker. You got to do what you got to do, and if you got to go across country, then that's what you do. At the very beginning of the invasion, Ukrainians blew up the railroad bridges near the borders of their country with Russia, and they apparently destroyed much of the rail networks as well. The Russians are having a devil of a time with that. Then they concentrated on interdicting Russian supply, and this is probably the number one reason that 40-mile convoy northwest of Kyiv became stalled. Reports of no gas, no food, flat tires, no parts, all that stuff are legion. Lost, you name it. Russia totally misunderstood the resolve of Ukrainians to fight for their country. and were totally unprepared to operate in the new environment in which they found themselves. It's not what they expected. It turns out the Russians used their military largely just like the Iraqis did theirs, which is, we got a lot, we got numbers, who cares about training or strategy or command and control? This isn't actually surprising to me, because the Russians supplied and taught those client states how to use their war machine. That doesn't mean that the Russian war machine, or even the Iraqis, is not dangerous. Indeed it is. There is a common refrain about the Russians, and that is that quantity has its own quality. But it's not the force the Red Army posed to NATO across the Fulda Gap. Okay? The Ukrainians know the countryside, and they're receiving supplies and ammunitions via a clandestine network. We don't need to hear about it on the news because it becomes a target. If they can continue to own the countryside, the Russians will not be able to defeat them. At this point in the war, Zelensky and the government are no longer the main center of gravity, whose capture or destruction would enable Russia to end the war. It ain't going to happen, I don't think. As long as Ukraine forces maintain the initiative, can keep the Russians on the back foot, they own the countryside, the Russians have roads. Ukraine is still seriously in the war. The weapons that allow them to do that are the U.S.-made anti-aircraft Stinger, the anti-armored Javelin, and the British anti-armored Inlaw, the light anti-tank weapon. These are man-portable fire-and-forget weapons that in guerrilla warfare can exact a debilitating cost to Russian occupation. Small units of infantry can move about countryside. They have to be small to stay hidden, basically. To employ these effective weapons at his hit-and-run attacks on Russian columns, or in conjunction with several others, pin them and destroy them. This further restricts Russian operations to roads and cities. The Russians cannot sustain a long-term occupation. They simply don't have the reserves, and the apparent rumors that they're asking the Chinese for economic and military resupply is kind of an indicator. Even now, they have begun drawing down men and equipment from other parts of Russia to support operations in Ukraine. They are unable to identify and strike a center of gravity important enough to make Ukrainians surrender. I actually don't think there is a CG that affects the Ukrainian will to fight. I see the Russians resorting to a flat-net strategy to level Ukraine's cities. This will create a humanitarian nightmare, a diminished Ukrainian people, and a position of power that will allow Russia to withdraw to its borders and leave the international community to pick up the pieces. That's what's going to be in the negotiation. They're going to hold it like an iron fist. They'll let it go. You have to pick up the mess. And with other guarantees. This is not the first time the Russians have followed such a strategy, and I don't see how they're going to spend anything in an effort to clean up the mess they've created or to support the displaced persons. It ain't happening. This will fall to the rest of the world to take on. And I see one of the failures of U.S. and NATO leadership, is the UN, please, is anticipating the next moves here, the what-ifs. As in, what if the Russians pull out and leave Ukraine a devastated mess, unable to support itself? With no seaports available, there should be preparations being made right now to deal with this. Starvation happens pretty quickly. This is a humanitarian crisis on an unprecedented scale. Time will be of the essence when those hostilities cease, and they will. We don't know when. Russia will have taken Crimea and the port cities, as well as the oil fields and the pipelines centered around Odessa. I think that's their objective. There's no talks until they get there. They just smash things on the way. The refugee crisis is just now hitting Poland hard. I heard about 1.9 million of the refugees are there. But what happens at the ceasefire? What would a ceasefire look like, and what would be left of Ukraine and its people? How would they survive? The rest of the world has to deal with the failure of the UN. This is a worldwide crisis on its own. Is the UN even relevant anymore? Have the Russians created a situation where an ineffective UN will be replaced by a repurposed NATO? Interesting. Putin put Russia nukes, the nuclear weapons on alert as a counter to prevent U.S. and NATO interference. We're going to hold them off, stiff arm them. They can't be involved, or it's World War III. This was an effective threat, but because the nuclear threat's going to make sure there's going to be no active, overt interference from that avenue. The commitment of Russian forces in Ukraine has risen to the point where they do not have the resources to invade Poland. I really don't think, and I slept on a Holiday Inn Express, but I really don't think that World War III is a serious threat here. They just don't have the resources. What is a serious threat is the post-war world. Conflict looms large on the windscreen here. Cold and hot wars of various sizes are going to come back in fashion. Globalism is on the precipice of a collapse, with the looming Cold War between China and Russia together against the rest of the world. Okay? And the whole economy of the world is so tied up in globalism, that means huge problems. Strong leadership in the U.S. is required to shape the post-Ukraine war world, and it's time for vision, resolve, and a deep understanding of the real world as it is, not as we would like to see it. We have to know how it is before we can remake it, or keep people alive here. That's the objective. With the news totally occupied with Ukraine, the Middle East is heating up with conflict between Israel and Syria, China versus Taiwan, maybe the whole world, and don't forget North Korea either. He's firing ballistic missiles off, and he's rattling sabers. So, hey, pay attention to him too. The world as we knew it has changed. That's the bottom line. And it's time we need to be adults and take to the task of fixing it seriously and realistically. That's my nickel. It's the way I see it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on FlyWire.